Let's take a look at our very first data type, and we're going to be looking at the numeric type, and it's one of the biggest ones that you're going to use. Numbers are a huge thing in programming as well as computers in general. Now there are four distinct numeric types. The first one is a plain integer, and integers are pretty common. Everyone sees them every day. They're like whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They can be the positive, they can be the negative of those numbers, it doesn't really matter. But in computer languages, you have to keep in mind that a plain integer, especially in Python, has 32 bits of precision. And that means that you can only go so big with those numbers before, the precision dies off. If you want to go bigger, what you have to do is change data type and go over to a long integer. And that one has unlimited precision. The difference between the two when you look at them is that a long integer is going to have a suffix of L, either capital or lowercase. And we'll take a look at that in the interpreter in a second. The next data type for numbers are floating point numbers, and that's any number with a decimal place in it. Now there are complications with the precision on this. It really depends on the computer that you're on to say how precise that floating point number can be. And if you're doing anything that takes a very, very accurate number and deals with floating point numbers like dollar amounts for accounting software and things like that, you have to watch it, because when you start doing arithmetic with floating point numbers, depending on the accuracy of the computer, this can give you different results. The very last numeric type would be a complex number. Complex numbers we're not really going to touch on in this course. They're really used by scientists, mathematicians, electricians, and all that kind of stuff to give a more 2D type of a number, whereas an integer would be very linear, one-dimensional. You have positive, negative, and you go from one number to the next. Whereas a 2D number would deal with a complex situation for solving unsolvable problems. So that's just, we're not going to get into that, but just so you know, there is a data type called complex numbers. In addition to all this, we have booleans, which are a subtype of the plain integer. So a plain integer has numbers such as 0 and 1, and a boolean consists of those two numbers, zeros and ones. In Python, we'll learn about booleans, and they're also represented as trues and false, none, and different things like that. The next is the standard Python library also includes additional numeric types such as fractions that hold rationals, and decimal, which holds floating point numbers with a user-defined precision. So if you are looking for that floating point number with an extreme precision and you want to make sure you got that right, you can use a data type called decimal, and you can actually set the precision using that. Now, you can mix these numeric types when you're doing arithmetic, and we'll get into arithmetic in the next video, but say you had an integer and you wanted to add that into a float or multiply it by a float or something. What happens is it takes the narrower type and then just converts that to the wider type. So for instance, I have a couple of examples here. An integer, which is at the top of the list, if we put that together with a floating point number, then the integer would be converted over to a floating point number. In the same way with floating point, with complex, the floating point would be converted up to a complex number. And a plain integer would be converted up to a long integer. So those things just happen and they all just work, so you don't have to be afraid of mixing the data types in that sense. Now there are some functions that can help us convert different values into integers, floats, longs, and complex, and I've listed those down here and we'll discuss those later. Let's go over to the interpreter and test a few things out. So we're going to use that type function that we talked about before, and I'm just going to put in that number 5, and we'll just hit enter, and we'll see that that is an integer. So plain integer is often referred to as just integer, and the short form for that would be int. So let's go do type, and we talked about putting a capital L on the end of the number and giving us a long. So we can do that, and you can see it's type long in that case. We can do type 5 with a lowercase l, hit enter, and it's also going to be type long. Then we can also do type 5 and put a decimal place in it, and we'll just do 0.0. So it still represents 5, the number, but it's a floating point number, and the short form for that is float. Now let's move on to the last one, which would be a complex number. And most of us probably don't deal with complex numbers at all, but say we had the number 5, what we would do is multiply that by the imaginary number, which is to the power of -1, the root of -1. So The short form for that is in Python, we just put a J there, and this is going to be type complex. Now, typically if you see this formula, the J would be an I, but the problem is this type is used quite a bit in electrical engineering and things like that, and I represents current in that industry, so they've switched to J, and Python's just copied that. But really, complex numbers, I don't think we're ever going to be dealing with two-dimensional numbers, in the beginner's course at least, so don't really have to worry about it too much. Alrighty, so let's take a look. Those are all the different numbers, so let's take a look at converting something over to a floating point number. So say we had a float. We have this float function here, which again, we'll talk about functions later, but let's just say that this works. This is a tool that you can use. So we want to turn something into a float, so we call a float, then we wrap it, and we're just going to take the integer of 5, no decimal places, just the integer, and if we hit enter, we can see it returns 5.0. It converts the 5 over to a float, an integer to a float. One thing you should understand is that what we need to put in there is either a string, which we'll get into in a bit, or a number. And in this case, we put a number in so it was valid. Let's take that floating point number and convert it over to an integer. So I can do int, that's one of my functions, and I can put 5.0, which is a floating point number, end bracket, and push enter, and you'll see it converts it by dropping off everything past the decimal place and leaving you with the whole number of 5. Now a long is pretty simple. I can just do long, and we'll just put 5 in there, and that's just a regular plain integer, and if I just hit enter, it returns 5L, meaning that it's 5 still. It's still the same value, only now it's considered a long data type, so it has unlimited precision. And complex is easy too. We'll just do complex, pass it 5, and it's just going to return pretty much what we had before. So anyways, those are that's how we can convert from one type to another in numeric types by using these function calls here. Also, we learned about the 4 main types, and we showed some different variations on how they actually look.